I'm Mike Doran from the Hudson Institute, and I'm speaking about why America doesn't understand the Middle East. What I'm going to say to you is that I think there's a kind of dominant paradigm that we have inherited for seeing the Middle East. That paradigm is totally wrong. Then we have people who, over time, came to understand that the paradigm is wrong. Not everyone did, and there are critiques of the paradigm. Those critiques of the paradigm are based on correctives, or they offer correctives that are not entirely wrong-headed, but they don't help us to see the Middle East clearly. I think, of course, I see the Middle East clearly, and I'll try to offer a little of that to you at the end, but I'll spend most of my time talking about how everybody else sees it incorrectly. But I'm happy to enlighten you if you like. Our view of the Middle East, we inherited from the from the mainline Protestants, from Protestant modernism, and in particular from the missionaries, primarily Presbyterian missionaries, who go over to the Middle East. And the first thing you find when you try to explain to a Muslim why he should convert to Christianity is that they're very hostile to the idea, and they tell you to go away, or they take a sword out and chop off your head. So when the missionaries encountered this resistance to proselytization, they moved to a different tack, which is based on the social gospel, which is we won't sell doctrine and belief. What we will sell are good works, education, healthcare, taking care of the poor, and this kind of thing. And what we'll do is we'll make alliances across religious boundaries with like-minded people, those strains in the Muslim tradition that are similar to our way of understanding Jesus' teaching. So we take Jesus out of it, focus on good works, and make alliances across boundaries. Now, this is this mission. This was an expansion of the intra-Protestant mission of the mainline churches. So they started out with an ecumenical impulse to break down the boundaries between the different different Protestant groups, and then they expanded it out to beyond Christianity to Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims and so on. And so as time went on, well, the missionaries began to see themselves less as evangelists for Christianity and more as ambassadors for Christianity. And then they populated the government, all of our experts. They populated academia and the CIA and the State Department, and they transposed their mission onto the United States, so that the missionaries who saw themselves as ambassadors actually became ambassadors. And by this point that they became ambassadors, they had totally secularized their sense of mission and transposed it onto the United States. So the goal of the United States then in the Cold War is to make alliances with like-minded Muslims across across boundaries and so on. Now, this sense of what America's mission in the Muslim world came with a number of deep assumptions about that project. One assumption is we can arrive at a universal peace, or not necessarily a universal peace, but we can arrive at a modus vivendi with everyone in the Middle East. That is possible, and that idea is based fundamentally on another sort of deep American idea, which I think all Americans inherited from thinking about international politics at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and that's that the mission of the United States is to foster freedom, democracy, and self-determination around the world. Now, those ideas developed as we watched European empires crack up and peoples of Europe struggle for self-determination. The Greeks, the Italians, and so on and so forth. We took that idea and we also applied it to the Middle East. Now there was a problem. The Ottoman Empire was not made up of a lot of nations in waiting. When the Turks were thrown off, the nations popped up, and there was an awareness among American Middle East experts that this was the case, and the missionaries. And so one of the things that the missionaries were engaged in the Middle East wasn't just doing good works. They were also teaching the Middle Easterners to be nationalists, right? Bringing nationalism to the Arabs and saying, this is the way you should organize yourselves. Then came World War I, and the Ottoman Empire is cracked up. And in its place, we have the British take over, and they set up the mandate system. And the idea is that the British now the Middle East is divided into nation states, but some of them don't have a long history of self-governance, and so the mandate system is going to help them along until they're ready for self-governance. That gave rise to something called that I'm going to call the broken promises narrative, which I think is very important for understanding the American attitude toward the Arab world. The broken promises narrative says we Arabs would be functioning as nation states living peacefully in a world of other nation states if you Westerners had been true to your commitment to having a world of nation states, of independent nation states working together, living together with nation states. So your failure, especially the British, your failure to live up to your own values is why we are not organized the way we think we should be organized. And the biggest affront to the principle of national self-determination was the creation of the state of Israel, right? So the greatest impediment to having a peaceful, well-ordered Middle East was the creation of Israel, which was the product of Western imperialism. To put it a little more broadly, Western imperialism itself is the reason why the Middle East is so messed up, and the creation of Israel was a product of that, or was a part of that imperial project. Now, the American elite, particularly the experts on the Middle East and the academia and CIA and State Department, they absorbed this worldview 100%. Why? They didn't absorb it. They created it to begin with, because it's the missionary, the argument, the broken promises argument that the Arabs play to the West, that you screwed us up and you suppressed our nationalism, and that's why there is violence and extremism in our midst. That is the explanation that the Protestant missionaries taught the Arabs to play back to the Americans. So our image of the Middle East and what is wrong with it is an image that was totally created by us, right, and has very little to do with sentiments coming up out of the ground in the Middle East. And at heart, and at the heart of it is this anti-Zionism, and there's a sense. Down to this day, it's shocking to see. A few weeks ago, I had an argument with a guy who's a respected former diplomat at a think tank in Washington, who spent years in the Middle East, in the Arab world, and he said, I like you. You seem to be a relatively well-informed guy, and you seem to be a relatively nice guy, but this thing about you liking Israel and thinking that it doesn't harm our relations with the Arabs, it's ridiculous, right? And so we had to argue it out. And it got nowhere. He just had to get it off his chest, basically. But he still believes. And I said to him, look at all the people dying in Syria. Do you really think that if we distance ourselves from Israel, it's going to improve the position in Syria, Iraq, or he can't answer these things. He can't. It becomes sort of magical. He said, okay, it's not going to have an immediate effect, but it's going to change the atmosphere. And so anyway, but so believe me when I say down to this day, this still exists. Okay, now a lot of people, particularly Israelis, pro-Israeli people, but other people as well, over time they recognize that this view of the Middle East is wrong. And there are a few antidotes that pop up, but I think they're highly inadequate. One antidote was, and they come to explain, why do we have this violence in the Middle East, and particularly this anti-Western sentiment? And one argument, I'll just throw out a couple, and you'll recognize them immediately. One says, okay, democracy deficit. That's the problem. Problem is tyranny. And if we go and solve the problem of tyranny, then we'll have a rightly ordered, peaceful Middle East. We tried that, didn't work, right? So you're left with the answer, well, we didn't do it enough. We have to do more of it, or it's something else. But then another argument you hear a lot is, well, the problem is Islam. The problem is Islam, and we need a reformation in Islam. We have to find a Muslim Martin Luther and so on. And we could come up with other explanations that people have. I think they're all inadequate. And they're even if there's some validity to them, they're not projects that policy can possibly solve. American policy is not going to create a reformation in Islam. It's not going to happen. American policy is not going to bring democracy to the Middle East. Not going to happen. And we can be more supportive of this group and that group and so on and so forth. Okay, so why is the Middle East then so complex? Now I'll tell you what the Middle East is all about, and then we can open it up. The Middle East that was bequeathed to the modern world is really not set up to be a region of nation states. That the project of turning the Middle East into nation state, where a country in which the boundaries of the nation, where there is a self-conscious group that feels itself to be with a strong degree of affinity, and that the boundaries of that nation are more or less coterminous with the boundaries of the state. It is if the all-powerful Martians came down and wanted to map out a Middle East like that, it's not possible. When you look at the sociological material that's there, there are a few states in the region that are something approaching a nation state, like Egypt. Iran, sort of, kind of. It's closer. Iran is closer to a nation state than Iraq or Syria and so on. But then we have these countries like Iraq and Syria, so you have a number of elements here that are, I think, unique to the Middle East. They're not unique to humanity, but the complex of them is unique to the Middle East. One is very powerful political communities that cross international frontiers, right? Look, if you look at the sociological material in Canada and the United States, we're all Anglo-Saxon. It's all very similar, right? So we speak the same language, have many of the same traditions and so on. But American politicians don't excite the Canadian public. Canadian politicians don't excite the American public. There's no Canadian prime minister. Somebody here will tell me I'm wrong. I didn't know what happened in 1952, but no Canadian prime minister ever gave a speech, and people went out in the streets, in Philadelphia in excitement, right? But this is common. This is not uncommon in the Arab world, for example. In the Middle East, you can have Iran stick its hand into Lebanon, create a militia, which everyone in Lebanon knows is created by Iran. There's no illusions about this whatsoever. And for a very large number of Lebanese, that is totally legitimate, right? This isn't a foreign entity that's now, it's contested for sure. There are those who don't, but this kind of thing doesn't exist in other parts, even in Latin America, right? You don't have it. And if you do have it, you don't have it anything like to this degree. The other thing is the incredible deficit legitimacy deficit between the state and the society for many, many, many different reasons. But Middle Easterners don't believe that the states that rule over them are legitimate. And it's amazing when you talk to Middle Easterners how the gap that they feel between themselves and their fellow and their compatriots, and even people who have the same religion and speak the same language. Saudi Arabia is a patchwork of countries, right? The Hijaz is not the Najd, and the Hijazis don't think of themselves as being from the same country as the Najdis. The Najd being the armpit of the universe, which happens to be oil rich, where the Saudis come from, and the Hijaz being where the holy cities are. Hijaz is more cosmopolitan because that's where people come to for pilgrimage and so on. And the Hijazis will talk about, okay, now the Najdis are ruling over us, but this is not, Rusty says America will not live forever. Saudi Arabia, in the eyes of the Hijazi, Saudi Arabia is not going to live forever. And it's really historically a relatively recent thing. What we've got, if you want to think of what it's like in the Arab world, it's like Italy. This last summer, my wife's mother's Italian, and we went down to Calabria, where the family comes from, to go to her grandfather's grave. And the village where they come from is a mafia village. They don't call it mafia; they call it Indragata. So we go to the village, and by the time we get to the village, everyone in the village knows who we are, right? And we have a family member basically showing us around. And it's a very impoverished village, and then you have these two huge, expensive villas right in the middle, right? Two very rich people live in these villas. And as we're leaving, I asked our guide that was showing us around from the family, and I said, "Who are the richest guys in Natile?" Natile is the name of the village, and he said, "Nessuno, no one. We're all the same. We're all the same in Natile, right?" And that's the way it is in the Middle East, right? The affiliations, the loyalties are profoundly local. There's a local power structure. The guys in the local are not going to tell outsiders, even somewhat trusted outsiders, what's really going on the ground, right? And if you don't have a sense of this profoundly parochial local thing, you don't understand what's going on there. The politics goes, you have states vying for power using these networks, and the minute you go, you have the state, you have the larger religious community, which does not have as much purchase over people in their day-to-day politics as we're led to believe. And then you have local networks. And then you have patchworks of local networks. That's what you have. That's what you have. And it's very difficult. We use concepts to talk about the Middle East and to try to reach people that have no purchase over how they actually see the world. Now, for those of you Israelis, you guys know this, whether you know it or not. You have towns in Israel like Abu Ghosh, right next to Jerusalem, on the highway from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Abu Ghosh never fought the Zionists, right? Why? Because Abu Ghosh didn't fight the Zionists. Because the political unit is the village, or maybe the locale. You have a lot of these places all over Israel. That's the way it is throughout the whole Middle East. And this combination of states run by people who understand that this is the nature of the vying with other states, using these networks against each other. It is too much for the American mind to fathom, right? It's not that hard once you know it, but you can't understand the Middle East with simple categories. It's never a two-sided struggle. It's always a multi-sided struggle, and to really understand what's going on, you have to have a lot of local knowledge to really understand. I'll give one more example, and then sum it up with one last point, what it means for the U.S. So a guy I know was in the military, and in Iraq, and the railhead at the crossing, they were building a railroad from Baghdad over to the Syrian border, and at the Syrian border crossing, the railhead was blown up. And he was a commander, and he went out to go talk to his men there. see who blew it up. And he said to his man, who blew it up? And the local officer there said, well, it was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, because this was going to be a profound victory for the new Iraq, and Al-Qaeda wants to discredit that victory, and so on. And my friend, who was a little bit more savvy, said, how would goods get from the Syrian border to Baghdad before the railroad? He said, well, there are these trucking companies. And he said, every one of the sheikhs out here, they're all, right, a bunch of tribes on the border. Every one of the sheikhs has a trucking company. He said, oh, so you're telling me that if the railroad is actually completed, they'll be out of work. And the light bulb went off in the guy's eyes, because he suddenly realized it, and he was profoundly hurt, because he meets with these guys every day, and they tell him how much they love America, and they tell him how much they love the railroad, and all the great things that the United States is doing for them and their livelihood, and how much they hate Al-Qaeda, and how Al-Qaeda is really the enemy. And then he realized that it was actually they who blew, maybe together with the Syrian government, they blew up the railhead, and then they blamed it on Al-Qaeda. Now, I don't want to say that all the violence that Al-Qaeda and the radical Islam Muslims carry out is of this nature. There are these movements, right? They do exist. They do have independence and so on. But you find that they really have a basis from which to work, and a hold over the local population when the local population tolerates them, right? And if the local population doesn't want to tolerate them, it can help to get rid of them. So in order to understand the Middle East, you really have to understand local politics rather than things like extremists versus moderates, or I don't know, whatever. I'll end. I have to end here, and I'll just say one last thing. The thing that is hardest for the Americans to deal with is that there's this struggle for mastery going on in the region, and I didn't go into how I would understand that at this moment, but just there's no possibility. This is the key thing here. There's no possibility of bringing peace to the Middle East. If we want to be the dominant power in the Middle East, we have to be in perpetual conflict, or ready for perpetual conflict. It's in the nature of the region. Now, we can do that better or worse, but there's no way, because they are at war with each other, and it's not a simple war. It's a multi-dimensional war. And there's something in the American character that doesn't want a war that won't end, right? We want a solution. We want to find the key, right? Which was we used to think it was solving the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that will unlock the perpetual peace. We want that, and we've been told from day one that we got involved in the Middle East that such a thing exists, that there's a formula for creating universal peace, and it simply doesn't exist. Thank you.